Brittany from Imagine This, a music and art studio for both children and adults, and today we are going over Art 2's lesson. Art 2 is our intermediate course, and today we will be going over watercolor techniques. So before we begin, I will show you what we will be needing for this class today. So the supplies for this activity, I don't think Imagine This will be providing any, but if you need a watercolor set, just contact us and you can borrow one. But what you will need for this activity is a watercolor set, some paintbrushes. You can just have one as long as it works for you, but having a nice set of at least 3 is really helpful. A glass of water, a towel or paper towel, and then this is optional, but some table salt as well would be really helpful for part of our activity. So let's get started. All right, so first thing we're going to do is we are just going to go over the different techniques that we can do with watercolors. And the first one we are going to do is called wet on wet. The wet on wet technique just means that your brush is wet while the watercolor is very wet as well. So there is a lot of water as you're doing this. I'm just going to make sure that my brush has a whole ton of water in it and that there's quite a bit of water on the watercolors as well. And what happens is the more water you have with the color, the lighter the color will be. So if you want really light, delicate looks, this is probably the best technique to do so. So wet on wet, you get a very light, watery look to it. If I want, I can even add some more water to that, lighten it up quite a bit. And you'll notice I'm dipping into a very dark color, but because I'm using wet on wet, it makes it very light and delicate. Now the next technique is dry on wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry off my brush on my towel right here. I'm going to try and get as dry as I possibly can, or maybe even switch it for a different brush. But I'm not going to dry out the palette right here. I'm going to let that stay wet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my dry brush and I'm going to dip it in there. Now there's less water, so this means the color will still be lighter than usual, but darker than what we did with the wet on wet technique. I'm just going to dry off my brush again, dip it into that wet palette. And of course, layering makes a difference as well, darkening the color as you go. But you'll already notice there's a huge difference between dry on wet and wet on wet, with wet on wet being very light, and we're gradually getting darker as we dry out our brush. Now this next technique is called dry brush. Now our brush, again, it needs to be as dry as we can possibly get it. And you'll still need the colors to be wet because if they're completely dry, you won't be able to pick up anything, but they can't be super wet either. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to dab out a little of the excess water from my palette. Not too much. You might get a little bit on your towel or paper towel, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a dry brush, I'm going to dip into that. You'll notice it's going to be really dark. It's going to look a lot more like acrylic using this technique. It's built up quite a bit on the brush, and what I'm going to do is just brush that on. Notice how much darker and thicker it looks on the paper. And if I just drag it out, you'll see how dry it is and all the separate bristles using this dry brush technique. If you want really dark, really fast, this is the best technique to do it. But if you really want to build from lightest to darkest, this probably isn't the one for you. But if you want those really nice darks or a really cool texture, I definitely would suggest doing a dry brush. Now there's another cool technique that we have, and honestly the best one to do is probably dry on wet for this one. This includes some table salt. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly do the dry on wet technique, making sure there's quite a bit of water built up in my palette, and drying off my brush. I want to make sure there's a decent amount of water. Just going to quickly put this down on the paper. All right, and while this is still wet, what you want to do is you want to get some salt out. And you don't want a whole lot, just a little bit. So I'm just going to dump a little salt into my hands. Then I'm going to quickly sprinkle it on the wet watercolor. Now you'll notice, you probably won't be able to see, but I'll do my very best to show you. The salt crystals actually begin to absorb some of the coloring within the watercolor, so it actually creates this cool little speckled or starry effect. Now I'm going to give that a minute to dry and let it absorb to show you its full effect. But for now, let's go on to the next and final technique that I have for you. So the last technique is called blotting. This is when you apply watercolor to a page and then you use a paper towel or a towel to take color back or take it off of the page, which can actually cause some really cool textures and take back a color if it is too dark. So just using that same color, I'll do a dry on wet technique or wet on wet. Just going to quickly put that down on the page. You need a good amount of water for this one. And this won't work when it's dry. So while it is still wet, if you notice, oh, that's too dark, I don't like it, what you're going to do is take your towel, just gently tap onto the paper. See how much that lightened it since we just painted it a second ago, and also it creates this really cool texture that is the fibers of the towel. So if you want to try something like that, that's a really cool solution as well. All right, now I'm going to go back to the salt area and I'm going to gently brush off the excess salt. The camera's not going to pick it up super well, but you'll notice that there are just little dots all over, and that's from the salt absorbing the watercolor, which I think is a really cool technique whenever doing galaxies or stars. You just want a little interesting texture in it. All right, so now we have all these tools in our tool belt, so what are we going to do with it? Well, I thought I'd also show you how we could do some detailing with watercolors as well. And the best way I know how to do detailing with watercolors is with flowers. So I'm going to get a new page out, and it doesn't have to be a full page. I just cut this one down. Now you're thinking flowers, there's not a whole ton of details, right? Well, this is a fake flower, but if you look very closely in the petals, you'll notice there are actually little veins from where the water travels through in the flower. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and convey that within the flower. Now again, watercolors, you want to go from lightest to dark. So there is a bit of a layering process when it comes to watercolors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the wet on wet, trying to get the lightest color I can for my flower. I'll probably just use that same color because I quite like that magenta red purple color. All right, and if you're not comfortable going straight at the paper with your paintbrush, you are free to create a design first with pencil, but you need it to be pretty light because the water and paint will set that pencil and make it stay. So just do a very light tracing if you choose to do so. But I'm just going to do a flower very quickly. Might add a little more water because that's a little darker than I would like it. And of course I want details to be visible later. So the lighter I have the bottom layer, the more details I'll be able to add. Right, so I have about 5 petals for my flower right here. I'm going to lighten up this one. This one's just a little bit darker than the rest. So I might have to use that blotting technique just because adding too much water can possibly tear the paper. So I'm just going to use that blotting technique to pick up some excess color. All right, so now we have this bottom layer. It's very light, and we want to build it up to add some darks and to add some textures into it to show those veins going throughout the petals. But you want to give it a second between each layer because if you go in when the last one is still wet, those colors are just going to merge and it's not going to be as clean or as pretty as you would like it to be. So watercolor, the great thing about it is that it dries generally pretty quickly, which works very well in our favor. But as I go into my next layer of coloring, I'm going to use less water and a little more pigment. That way it gets gradually darker. So I want it to be pretty dark towards the center. I'm just going to go in with that same color again, a little less water, but a little more paint on my brush. Create sort of an ombre effect or gradient. I'm just going to spend the next little bit building up these colors, but remember, as you build them up, less water and more paint. Alright, so now I have the colors exactly where I want them, and you'll notice I still have those lights I started with, but as I started to darken it up more, I just slowly added less water, but I kept those spaces nice and light. Now it can be a little hard traveling from light to dark because you have to keep in mind what areas you want to keep light. I have a feeling that y'all can do that with a little bit of practice. Alright, so now for the detailing part. When most people think of watercolors, they don't necessarily think of very intricate detailing. They tend to think of more watery, loose looks, but detailing is possible with watercolors. You just have to be a lot more careful and using more of a dry brush or dry on wet technique than you would wet on wet or blotting. So I'm going to take one of my smaller brushes. You're going to want a smaller brush because the veins on a flower or within the petals are pretty small and delicate. You don't want a really big brush, but if you do, just use the very tip. Like this one may be a bigger brush, but it has a nice pointed edge that would do very nice for creating veins. So I think I'll actually use this one instead just because this one is a bit more circular and less pointed. So I'm just going to barely get this wet at all. Add some water into my color. I want to make sure I get a good amount of color on there. But again, not super runny. You want to use it more like you would acrylic paints. Right. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just barely using the tip. I'm not pressing down hard. I'm going to gently create lines going up into the flower. Now that's a little dark, so I might lighten it up with a little water. Maybe take some out in my jar. I'm just going to gently add details, not pressing super hard. The veins aren't all straight either. They spread, they kind of spiderweb out into the flower. So take your time and experiment with different strokes. Maybe you want a few to be a little darker. Maybe you want some lighter veins in there. That is how you create more detailing. You just have to be very careful. Again, not too much pressure. And since the veins aren't very dark, you don't want it to be complete dry texture, but you don't want too much water either. Just very gently, no pressure, drawing some spiderweb-like lines coming off of the flower. You can connect them to each other or have them totally separate, but this is how you show the water gets to the petal. I'm just going to quickly go in and do this to all the petals really quickly. Hello again, this is Brittany on a different day editing these videos, and I failed to notice that the camera actually quit out in the last minute of this video. Now there's nothing else I really have besides showing you the final result, so you didn't miss out on anything and you should be able to do this project successfully. But I just wanted to let you know that we hope you have a fantastic day and that we'd love to see your images. Have a good one!